It is the newly elected moderator, Pastor Stafford Petersen. And remember that when you spell his name, you don't spell it with an S-O-N at the end. It is an S-E-N. So he is Petersen with an S-E-N. Let's welcome him as he comes to do the devotion this morning.
Praise God. Good morning, everybody. Without much excuses, the morning devotion was scheduled for the incoming moderator. And obviously you can't be as presumptuous to prepare a message a week or two in advance because you don't know what the choice of the Lord will be. So this message was only prepared after the election, effectively meaning 1 a.m. this morning, because none of us could really know who God was going to choose. I'm going to take my reading from Exodus chapter 32. And I'm going to read from verse 1 through to verse 4. You will see it on the screen. You should see it on the screen behind me. And the Bible says, "Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, 'Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.' And Aaron said to them, 'Break off your golden earrings, which are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me.' So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hands, and he fashioned it with an engraving too, and made a molded calf." May God bless the reading of his precious word. The story contained in Exodus 32 is indeed a disturbing account of the history of God's people. Not only is it a disturbing account of the history of God's people, we find ourselves now in 2017, and throughout the history of Christianity, somehow there has been a theological move to diminish and to devalue the importance of the Old Testament. The hyper-grace movement that is sweeping through churches has come up with this devaluing of the Old Testament. Some theologians hold more value to the theology of grace as in the New Testament as opposed to the value of the Old Testament that was signed and sealed by law. There are those who believe that grace has successfully repealed and replaced the law. Now, I'm not here today to talk about grace or to talk about the law and to try and compare what we should hold dear to. But allow me to suggest to you this morning that there is value in the Old Testament. I don't care what the theologians have to say. I declare that there is value in the Old Testament. Why is there value in the Old Testament? Because when I read the Old Testament, it has some resonance with me. In the same way that when you read the Old Testament, it should have some resonance with you, because it sounds, when we read the Old Testament, like a familiar story. Why do I say it sounds like a familiar story? Because the Old Testament is to us a story of the relationship of a faithful God with an unfaithful people. The Old Testament for us is a story of a God who will continually find ways to be good to people, who will always find ways to be bad to God. It is a story of a God who loves some people, and of the truth, if the truth be told, those people are not really worth loving. It's a story of a God that faithfully loves a people who turns their back on him. Is a familiar story. It is a story of a merciful God, a God who shows mercy to a people who will always find new ways to mess up. Maybe I'm not talking to you this morning. Maybe you've never messed up. Maybe this Old Testament story does not have a resonance with you. It's a story of a God who will do exceedingly, abundantly, above what we deserve to a people who don't know how to really thank God. The Old Testament is a story of a people who will run to God when they need something, but who will run away from God when God expects something from them in return. The Old Testament has a resonance with me, a people who want God to do everything for them while they choose to do nothing in return. The reason you should hang out in the Old Testament now and then is not because of the boring text that you are reading. It is because when you read the Old Testament, it sounds like your story. It sounds like my story. How we expect from God, but when God expects from us, we are seldom found. That is not just the story of antiquity, but it is indeed the story of our lives today. Because continuously we find ways to stray from God, to hurt and harm one another, while God says, love one another. To move away with what we have when God says, take care of one another. I declare today, no matter how good we look, we have a tendency to find ways to be unfaithful to a God who characteristically remains a faithful God. And here is why you should read the Old Testament. Because when God, who is justified to act with his hand of wrath, he chooses to stay his hand of wrath and to exercise his hand of mercy. When we look at the devastation hitting the world today, many Christians say, oh, it is God's wrath. If it is God's wrath, why are we still here? Why are you still standing if the wrath of God is being exercised in the world? Because, brothers and sisters, if the wrath of God is being exercised, then none of us would still be standing. Even though God would be justified to rain down fire and brimstone upon us, but he chooses not to because of his great mercy. His mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Somebody say mercy. Can you say it like you mean it? Mercy. Let me tell you something today. You have never reaped everything you have sown because of his mercy. Can I say that one last time? You have never reaped everything you have sown. Because if you had to reap everything you have sown, none of us may be standing here today. But the merciful hand of God had kept us through it all. No matter what you said last night, God still allowed you to see the light of day this morning. No matter who you hurt yesterday, the mercy of God was extended to you this morning when you opened your eyes and you breathed in His breath. This God that we serve is a merciful and faithful God. Because of His mercy, He blessed you with some stuff that you did not deserve. Because of His mercy, He healed you at some point when you did not deserve to be healed. I would like to speak to some people this morning who knows that you have let God down. Maybe I'm not speaking to all of you, because maybe not all of us have ever let God down. But to those of you who knows what it feels like when you have let God down and still the hand of mercy is extended to us day in and day out. As harsh and as unmerciful as what we can be sometimes, as ugly as what God's people can become sometimes, God remains a God of mercy. I'm looking for a Psalm 136 kind of person this morning that says, oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for He is good. His mercy endures forever. The one thing that should make you shout is not how good the preacher is preaching, but rather that in spite of your sinful disposition, in spite of your wretched ways, God still woke you up this morning and showed you mercy. I don't know about you, but this is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it because of the merciful hand of a living God. There is something about this merciful God that should move us. Now, this is what happened in our chosen text this morning. Because by the time we get to chapter 32 of the book of Exodus, there are some things that has already taken place. In chapter 32, Moses is on the mountain. In chapter 32, God's people could no longer wait for Moses. In chapter 32, the people goes to Aaron and says, make us a God. Make us a God. In chapter 32, Aaron made them a God. But you see, it did not start in chapter 32. If you read the book and go to chapters before that, they started off in this book as slaves. But God still heard their cries. And God, in His great mercy, decides to raise up a man called Moses to deliver God's people. Before chapter 32, Moses goes to Aaron and says, Aaron, God says, let my people go. Aaron resists, and you know this better than me. Aaron resists. God sends 10 plagues. One of those 10 plagues was the angel of death coming around. Finally, Aaron realizes, I cannot mess with this God. You guys better get out of my town. So they leave. Before chapter 32, God opens for them the Red Sea. Before chapter 32, God closes the Red Sea on their enemies. They get onto the other side of the Red Sea. They rejoice and they give God glory. Then God speaks through Moses. And God gives, through Moses, Israel some commandments. Let's call it laws. So now God says, because I brought you, this is before chapter 32, because I brought you out of Egypt, there are now some things that I expect of you. It's not a free-for-all kind of God. It's a God that says, I have shown you my hand of mercy. I have opened the Red Sea for you. I have closed the Red Sea on your enemies so that they cannot consume you. So now I, your God, expect some things from you. And what I expect from you, I call them laws. Number one, God says to them, you shall have no other God but me. God says that's the first thing I want from you. All of this before chapter 32. Number two, God says to them, you shall not make any golden image of any other God. If you read chapter 24, Israel responds to God and says, God, we got this. We got this, God. You know, God, we will do what you expect of us to do. At the end of chapter 24, Moses is now called up the mountain to be with God because God wants to give Moses the entirety of the law. God says, now that Israel has agreed to this contract, that I have brought them out, and now I have some expectations on them, let me give them the entire contract on stone, effectively outlining God's expectations. So from the end of chapter 24 down to chapter 31, Moses is up on the mountain getting the law. In chapter 32, all hell breaks loose. Because Moses had been gone too long. So the people decides, because Moses is gone, we better do something. Aaron, make us a god. So they made a god. So they made a god. Because they wanted something that they could see. Because the man that represented God was not with them, and they wanted a God that they could see. So they made a God. Because Moses had been long or gone too long, so they made a God. Why would you trade a God who brought you up out of Egypt for a God that you can make? Why would you violate what God asks you 8 chapters before and exactly do what he expressly asked you not to do? Make another God. Why would you do that? You see, brothers and sisters, these children had made a discovery. And they discovered something. That whenever Moses gets alone with God, he always seems to come back with more law. They realize that if this brother comes off that mountain, there will be another list of do's and don'ts. When Moses comes down, brothers, let me tell you, we better get something sorted out here. Let's get a committee together, because when Moses comes back, he's about to tell us again how we can act and how we can't act. Moses will come back with some more expectations from God. And the reason why the story resonates with us today in 2017 is the following line, and I can even do the benediction after this line if I so choose, but I will not. And this is the line: nobody likes to be told what to do. You can be anointed, you can be appointed, you can have PhDs and HIDs and all the other D's behind your name. But there comes a time when people will rise up and say, don't tell me what to do. I've come to tell this church today, I don't care about your hyper grace. I don't really care about your opinion of the Old Testament. But this God that I serve has some laws. I don't really want to get into a debate with you about what is still important and what no longer is. Whether you like it or not, this God of the full gospel church of God has certain expectations of us. Whether you are grace-filled or not, whether you are mercy-led or not, this God has expectations on you and me. Let's put it as plain and simple. Whether you like it or not, you've already voted. This God has some laws. This God has some instructions for you and I. And brother, that's just how it is. No constitutional clause will change the demands of a living God. So they made a God. Why did they make a God? Because a God you make is a God you control. Because a God you make can no longer tell you what to do. Effectively, they wanted to create another God that would let them do exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to create another God who has no rules and who has no laws, so that they can continue to do what they want to do, because that's what they wanted. In verse 6 of chapter 32, what happens after they made a God? What happens after they make a God? They ate, they drank, and they played. When they made their God, they ate, they drank, and they played. Because now that we made you, let's eat, let's drink, and let's play. May I suggest that in this attempt, it was not as much about making a God as it was about trying to control the destinies of their own lives. I've come to tell you, my friend, you cannot serve God and control the destiny of your own life. You cannot serve two masters. The world does not want a God with rules. The world does not want to deny themselves, because the world wants to eat, drink, and play. We don't want to feed the poor. We don't want to take care of the widow. Let me eat, let me drink, and let me play, because I prefer a eating, drinking, playing God. I'm not interested in a God that has demands on me. That's what they were effectively doing. They wanted an eating, drinking, playing God. That's a good title for another message. Because I don't want a God that will tell me what to do. I don't want a God that has demands. And when they made their God, what they really did was making themselves God over their God. To live the way you want to have nobody tell you what you can do and what you cannot do, is a dangerous game. Let us just confess today, Lord, our ways are not your ways. Let us confess today, Lord, there are some things that you have instructed us to do that we did not like, so we did not do it. Because, Lord, let's just be truthful here, your demands are too great. Let's confess today that our dreams are not always his dreams. That our vision is not always his vision. That our desires, they're not always his desires. But it's time, brothers and sisters, that we go to a God that is higher than I. Let's go to the rock that is higher than I, a God that understands you, a God that has a deeper understanding than what you have, a God that has a deeper knowledge about you than what I have. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. What you need is not a God that you can control. What we need is a God that is bigger than us, a God that is wiser than us, a God that can lay down some laws that will benefit you in the long run. Because the laws of God are not created to restrict you, but to give you a better life in the long run. Because this God sees what you cannot see. Your vision is too small for you to be God. Your power is too finite for you to be God. He knows what's best for you. I downloaded another app the other day on my iPhone, and I think it was Sister Barry who introduced me to this app. I'm not sure if it was you. Did you introduce me to Waze? There we go. Waze, W-A-Z-E. And I discovered why Sister Barry likes the Waze app. Because the Waze app tells you a shorter route. It's a GPS app, pretty much like most of us have on our cell phones. Waze will take you the best way where you want to go. Waze will detect an accident ahead of you and tell you, take this off-ramp, bypass the blockage in the road. Waze will take you past congestion. Waze will warn you of potential hazards. And this is why I've discovered why Sister Barry likes Waze, because Waze can also tell you there's a cop around the corner. Slow down. If you are prepared to listen to a GPS device that gives you direction for where you're wanting to go, then why on earth would you not listen to a God who knows your future better than what you know it, who knows your destiny, who knows your direction, and he gives you some laws on how to get there. Sister Barry, this one is for you, because his ways are higher than your ways. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Full Gospel Church of God, this God is a God with directions. This God is a God with rules. This God is not a do as you please God. Not because he's a bad God. On the contrary, it is because he has your best interest at heart. Can you turn to somebody? Let me get Pentecostal on you. Tell your neighbor, he knows better. Let me pull this thing to a close. Moderator, that's closing number 1. Aaron said, bring me your gold earrings that's in your ears in your son's ears. It's a sermon for another day. And in your daughter's ears. Bring me the gold you have. Follow me. Please follow me. Because you may miss this point. A few chapters ago, they were slaves. A few chapters ago, they had no resources. A few chapters ago, they had no gold. And Aaron says to them, bring me the resources that God had blessed you with. Because when I remember what the Lord has done, when I remember that I used to be a slave and that now I have some resources, I may not see God, but I can see His provision. I may not see God, but I can see what He has done. He lifted me up of the deep miry clay, and He planted my feet on Canaan's highway. And this is the reason I'll sing and I'll shout, for Jesus came down and He lifted me up. Because you see, when former slaves get some gold, they think they've arrived. When former slaves get some gold, they print it on their business card. All of a sudden, they forget where they got their provision from. And now they use the very upgrade that God had allowed them to experience to make their God. The very thing that God blessed them with, they now use to make their God. Let us as a church of God be careful. Let us as a church of God be careful that we don't use the blessing of God and make us what we should never think of ourselves. Let us not become boastful. Let us not become big-headed. Let us not become position-orientated with the very blessings that God has given us. Remember who gave it to you. The God of Israel, the God of Isaac, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob. He gave you what you've got. Where does your position come from? Where does your house come from? Where does your ministry come from? God sees your future. Brother, your education did not get you your home. It's all God, baby. It's not your brother. It's not your sister. It's not your mama. It's not your papa. It's not your pastor. It's all Him. Everything you have is because of His goodness. I said everything you have is because of His goodness. They doubted that God was real because they could not see Him. They saw the provision, but they did not see the God. And they made a God because Moses was gone too long. They believed that the absence of Moses, this is a good line to preach, pastors, when you're not going to be in your pulpit for a week or two. They believed that the absence of Moses was an absence of God. They did not believe that the little deacon or the big elder that is standing in the gap for you to preach next Sunday represents God. I've come to tell you today, Moses did not pay the price for you. Moses did not save you. When snakes bit you and you did not die in the desert, it was not Moses. It was God, baby. It was all God. I said it was all God. It was all Him. It was all God. Look to God. Look to God. I declare to you, it was not man who opened the Red Sea. It was God. Because in the text we have read, they said, this man Moses that brought us up. It wasn't Moses that brought you up. Moses did not let rain or let manna rain down from heaven. Moses did not provide you with quail. Moses did not make the bitter water sweet. It was not Moses. It was God. Let us today, as a full gospel church of God, acknowledge that we will make no other God. That whether you are hyper grace or hyper mercy or hyper cool or just hyper, this God has rules. This God has expectations. This God gives direction. This God says, no, you can't. Not because I don't want you to have it, but because I see into your future that this that you're asking for will not serve you any benefit. His ways are higher than your ways. God bless you.